hospital after the fight. I can hear everything that's going on. And then I hear the doctor say, we have to operate on him now, otherwise he's going to die.
Hello from London on this fine summer's day. Just finished watching Chris Eubank Jr. on Diary of a CEO with Steven Bartlett, and this episode was an absolute banger. And the thing is, I wouldn't have necessarily thought, I'm quite a big boxing fan, and I wouldn't have previously thought of Chris Eubank Jr. as a Stoic. In fact, he's very rational and calm and doesn't express his emotions and doesn't seem fazed by things, prior to the build up to this fight. So I might have actually had him in the Broic category prior to this, funnily enough. But this episode demonstrated not just one or two, like some of the figures that we look at here, but all 5 of the kind of core Stoic techniques that we teach on the channel. And it's just, that's actually quite rare. I've not seen that before. So it's an absolute banger of an episode. Let's watch a few of these clips. But before we do, if it's your first time here, I'm Sam, the Stoic Teacher, Philosophy and Theology graduate from the University of Cambridge, and I have the pleasure of being an assistant head teacher in London. And here we talk about the philosophy of Stoicism and how it might help us, how ancient wisdom from modern times might actually help us level up in many, many different ways. And Chris Eubank Jr. is a really good example of someone who seems to be, knowingly or unknowingly, practicing the 5 core Stoic techniques that we teach here. So the first one, as you'll know, is the Dichotomy of Control. And what's interesting is, anyone that was watching the build-up to the Chris Eubank Jr. Conor Benn fight will know that this fight was to do with the legacy of their fathers. So many years ago, both of these guys' dads, Chris Eubank Sr. and Nigel Benn, had actually had like an epic British fight. And so this fight was billed as the battle of the families and the battle of the sons. And it was pretty crazy build up to the fight. Chris Eubank egged Conor and slapped him with an egg, which everyone was talking about, I think without realizing why he'd done it. And the reason he'd done it was that Conor Benn, for the first fight, had actually been caught, or however you view it, had been found with things in his bloodstream that he shouldn't have had, and blamed like a corrupted egg or something like that for it. So then there was a whole subplot and everyone was talking about it. Now, since the fight, the thing everyone's been talking about is the fact that Chris Eubank Sr. actually turned up to the fight. And the reason that's been a big thing is that Chris Eubank Jr. has been very vulnerable and open about the fact that his dad hadn't spoken to him for many years. And this episode, he really dug deep into that. And what really struck me was that there wasn't really a second where he was closed off at all. He was very vulnerable and very open. But at the same time, what he demonstrated is someone who's very calm. Because he talked about how his dad kind of texted him out of the blue after kind of years of not talking to him, and then speaking about him online, calling him a disgrace, and said like, call me. As we'll see in this clip.
I had bullets and coming from my family, my father. A couple of days before the biggest fight of my life, he's going into the media and saying I'm a disgrace.
What strikes me watching that clip is how calm he is, not just relaying it, but also just the steps in which he takes. Because all of us are nervous. Don't get me wrong. Like, Epictetus advised his own students. He said to them, look, I'm a sick person in a hospital bed advising you, who's also a sick person in a hospital bed. We'd all like to be like the Stoic sage, perfect equanimity, perfectly calm all the time. But Chris Eubank Jr. shows there his human side, where he was very nervous. He was, we all have that, don't we? Like, should I reply now? Should I not reply? How should I reply? All these different things. And the fact that he had that, but he dealt with it with such kind of class, really. Because a lot of people would have just been like, you called me a disgrace, I don't want to speak to you. But Marcus Aurelius tells us, he says, look, people are going to be malicious, ungrateful, all these negative things, he writes to himself, but he says, despite that, it's not in our nature to work apart from each other. And this is all humans in general, let alone a father and a son. But Marcus Aurelius says we're meant to work together like limbs of the same body. So yeah, it was really impressive. And it just showed that Chris Eubank Jr. there focused on what was within his control. Because if he was focused on all the other things, like, oh, he did this and he did that, then he probably would have not replied, and then we wouldn't have had this reconciliation. We also wouldn't have had the most epic moment in British boxing in recent times where they walked down down to the ring together. So yeah, really impressive. So that's technique 1. Whoosh. I'm gonna have some cool thing across the screen name. We'll get ChatGPT to do it and I'll send it. Right, second technique, voluntary discomfort. Now, there's a couple of different ways, and this was demonstrated in the episode. I mean, one of them is just when he talked about the way in which he was able to accept the fact that he was about to take some significant punishment. I think it talks about in the 7th or 8th round, as we see in the clip.
Thank God that I was wrong. Because if that had happened, it would not be a fight that is now going to be remembered for ever. This is what I'm being told. This is what I'm hearing. This is what I'm seeing.
Where he just says, it was time for war. Like, my coach is telling me, use the jab, which is basically, for non-boxing fans, it's kind of saying, be a bit technical, be a bit tactical, strategic, careful. And he's just like, it's just time. And the ability to do that, now I'm not saying Stoics say we should just lose it and beat people up, but in the boxing context, what he's saying there is he was willing to put himself in an uncomfortable position for ultimate growth. And that's what voluntary discomfort suggests to us, which is that if we want to be strengthened for times when we might need to face adversity, if we put ourselves in difficult situations now, then it'll be easier for us when we do face them. To use a boxing analogy, people often say, it's the punch that you don't see that knocks you out. And so if we can, sometimes some Stoics might have a cold shower when their hot water goes out. They're in a much better position than most. Some Stoics, intentionally choose to sleep on a harder surface. Just in the event that we might be uncomfortable at some times, we don't want to pamper ourselves too much. Marcus Aurelius, he was the Roman emperor, and he would write to himself. There's a Stoic method called physical definition. He writes to himself. He says, like, they're bringing him this expensive fish, and he says, he writes in the meditation, this fish is this is the corpse of a dead animal. It's just like the most unattractive description possible. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to toughen himself up so that he doesn't get too pampered and too soft, as it were, in the least offensive way of using that term. So yeah, voluntary discomfort, I think this whole thing of like being willing to take the punishment was, again, demonstrating that kind of inner toughness. Not that kind of broic, oh, I'm such a hard nut, even though this is quite close to that, actually, to be fair. But more just from a philosophical perspective, that ability to do it adds to this wider picture and this wider tapestry where we talk about all 5 techniques, of course. Next one, premeditation of adversity. Now, this is the one that really got to me. I mean, Chris Eubank Jr. has faced horrendous loss in the loss of his brother Sebastian.
I think that was the first time that I kind of got caught up a little bit in what was going on in my life.
But on top of that, his nephew, Raheem, now I think he said he's 3 years old or something, and he has to see him ask, where's his dad? This one hits really, really hard because, some of the people I love most in the world are my 2 nieces. They are literally the joys of my life, and thankfully, they have their parent. But it's just a horrible, horrible feeling. And from a Stoic perspective, this is why we premeditate adversity. We imagine our loved ones not being around. And again, this is like a mental version of the voluntary discomfort we discussed. And it's what became part of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is one of the most common ways we treat depression and anxiety in the UK. In exposure therapy, if you're scared of a kitten, they'll put you in a room with a kitten, your heart rate will spike, and then after you'll see and say, oh, I'm still alive, the kittens are just purring around, licking my hand. That's how they treat, so let's say, a cat phobia. And so for Stoics, the biggest fear we have is the fear of death. And so, I'm not saying, by the way, you should go and premeditate death, your own death or the death of loved ones. You need to start with smaller ones and then build up. That's the way the technique kind of suggests. But yeah, I mean, with that, he demonstrates this here where people were saying to him, isn't the weight cut really hard? And he said, well, no. What was hard, what was difficult, what was painful was losing my brother being buried in a desert in Dubai, seeing Raheem ask, where's my dad? And so that was a third way, he was kind of premeditating and just thinking about the wider context of death to kind of help him contextualize pain. And he used that technique, that Stoic technique, whether he knew it or not. And so Chris Eubank Jr., when he contextualizes things through death, and is able to comment on pain, but also speak, in a very vulnerable way around it, certainly demonstrates a number of the Stoic techniques, but in particular, kind of premeditation of adversity in terms of kind of inverted, but serving the same purpose, which is contextualizing what people were saying was painful, i.e. his weight cut, where he had quite a significant rehydration clause and it had quite a significant physical impact on him. And he said, well, he was able to contextualize that and in a way premeditate adversity to get through it by saying, like, Raheem, his nephew, not knowing where his dad is, and presumably the difficulties that Raheem might face in future, and that he might face in future when fielding Raheem's questions about where his dad is, to offset the pain of the weight cut by contextualizing what real pain actually is. So yeah, another really impressive use of Stoic techniques, whether he knew it or not. Number 4. Now, for most people, in one interview, you might see one technique or two techniques, but Chris Eubank Jr. in this interview showed all 5 Stoic techniques, and that's why it's so impressive. And so the view from above, which is our 4th technique that we teach, Chris Eubank talks of this moment where he's from the Conor Benn fight, after that war we described in Voluntary Discomfort. His face is puffed up from dehydration. He's in the hospital with like really severe pain after the fight, and he's just feeling really sorry for himself. And he says he has this moment where he hears the guy that's brought next door to him, that he hears the doctor say, we have to do surgery now or he might die.
I was in hospital after the fight. I can hear everything that's going on. And then I hear the doctor say, we have to operate on him now, otherwise he's going to die.
As we saw in the clip. And Chris Eubank Jr. says, from then, he was able to kind of take that view from above and contextualize his situation. And, this is exactly what the Stoics advise, which is, when faced with difficulty, first thinking to ourselves, you're in the corner of your room looking down, what does the problem look like now? Is it as big as you think? Then zooming out, like above all the houses, on the whole row of your houses, how does your problem compare to all of those on that road? Then zooming out further across the whole nation, how does your problem compare? Or the world. And this isn't about comparing and saying your problems aren't important. That's how some people, Broics might suggest it. But it's more just about having a sense of perspective. And that's exactly what Chris Eubank Jr. is describing, where he reflects upon his situation, where he's, got painful injuries from the fight, but the guy next to him might die if he doesn't have the surgery he needs. So view from above, tick. Final one. This one's interesting because in the course, when Ali and I talk about it in the Skillshare class, links below, Ali shows his various journaling techniques, and then I talk about my kind of bullet journal / time blocking method, but it doesn't have to be in the form of a written journal. There's so many different ways now. You can just take out ChatGPT and just talk everything into it or whatever. And Chris Eubank Jr., the way that I feel he's demonstrated that 5th technique of kind of reflection, journaling, which is what we call it in the course, is through his vulnerability in this podcast, And the way he's able to reflect on these matters, it demonstrates exactly what Seneca advises himself to do. He says, when his wife's gone to sleep and it's the early hours of the night, he sits and looks over his whole day and analyzes, where could I have been more kind? Where could I have been more measured? And the way in which Chris Eubank Jr. has reflected throughout this episode demonstrates exactly that from my perspective. Chris Eubank Jr., I don't know if he's read the Stoics. I mean, he may well have. But the way he lives and the way he has demonstrated these 5 Stoic techniques are truly those of a true Stoic. And so, based on this interview, certainly one would argue that Chris Eubank Jr. embodies the virtues that you would expect a modern Stoic to embody. And if you're interested in applying Stoicism to your daily life, whether it's to lose over 100 pounds or to improve something else, there's certainly a suite of techniques that Stoicism offers. So if you're interested, check the description to see how Stoicism might be able to support you. Do subscribe to the channel for some more ancient wisdom from modern times. Bye now.